I lost the baby on a Tuesday, and my brother's first words when he walked into that hospital room were not, "Are you okay?" I need you to sit with that for a second before I tell you everything else, because the rest of this story only makes sense if you understand who Colt has always been, and who my parents let him be for 29 years, while the rest of us adjusted ourselves around him like furniture rearranging around a crack in the floor. My name is Britta Callahan. I'm 33 years old. I'm an insurance fraud investigator based in Phoenix, Arizona, and 4 months ago I was 19 weeks pregnant when I collapsed in the middle of a deposition review at my office. No warning. No buildup. 1 second I was standing, 1 second I wasn't. My coworker Dessa found me face down between 2 filing cabinets, and the only reason she knew something was wrong before she even looked is because she heard the sound I made when I went down, and she said she never wants to hear that sound again as long as she lives. Before I go any further, if you found this video and something in the title made you stop scrolling, please subscribe and hit like before you keep watching. I need you to stay until the end, because what my brother said, and what it finally made my mother do after 34 years, is the part that will stay with you. The baby was a girl. We hadn't told anyone the gender yet. Marcus and I were waiting until 20 weeks, which was 9 days away. We had a name, and a color picked for the nursery walls, and a second-hand rocking chair that Marcus had already refinished twice because the first stain color wasn't quite right. He's like that. Quietly particular about things that matter to him. I used to find it endearing. I still do. I'm telling you that now, because later in this story, when everything around us is falling apart, Marcus is the one thing that held its shape, and I want you to know that about him early. I was airlifted to St. Callaway Medical. I don't remember the helicopter. I remember Dessa's face hovering over mine on the floor. And then I remember a ceiling that wasn't my office ceiling. And then I remember Dr. Vane's voice, my OB, saying my name in that specific tone that doctors use when they are choosing every single word very carefully. They could not find a heartbeat. They tried for a long time. I know they tried because Marcus told me afterward, and because I could see it in Dr. Vane's face. The particular kind of exhaustion that comes from hoping on someone else's behalf and running out of road. The official cause was a placental abruption, triggered by what they believed was an acute stress response. My blood pressure had spiked to a level that my body could not sustain. It had been climbing for weeks, Dr. Vane said carefully. Had I been under unusual stress lately? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I didn't even know where to start. Marcus called my parents from the hospital waiting room. My mom, Renata, answered on the second ring, which means she was already holding the phone. She does that when she's worried, carries it from room to room like a small, warm thing she can protect. Marcus told me she didn't say anything for almost 8 seconds after he told her. Just silence. And then, "We're coming right now." They arrived in under 40 minutes, which means Philip, my dad, drove faster than he has driven in probably 20 years. It came in together, and my mom went straight to me and held my face in both her hands and didn't say a single word, just looked at me, and that was the right thing. That was exactly the right thing, and I will love her for it for the rest of my life. Colt arrived 14 minutes later. I know the exact time because Dessa had come to the hospital, and she was sitting near the door, and she noted it on her phone without knowing why, and she told me later. 14 minutes after my parents. He came in already talking. Not to me. To my dad. Something about traffic on the I-10, something about parking. His voice was loud in that specific way it gets when he wants the room to notice he arrived. And then he looked at me in the hospital bed, looked at Marcus, looked at my mom's hand on mine, and said the thing. I'm not going to tell you what it was yet. I need you to understand Colt first, because if I give you that line right now, without the full picture of who this man has been my entire life, it won't land the way it deserves to. What I will tell you is this. My mother, Renata Callahan, who has stood beside Philip Callahan through 34 years of marriage, who has never once, not once, raised her voice at him in front of me or Colt, who has smoothed over every family dinner, absorbed every uncomfortable silence, translated every one of Colt's moods into something more palatable for the rest of us to swallow. That woman turned to her husband in the middle of that hospital room and said 4 words I have never heard her say to him in my entire life. And then she picked up her purse and walked out. To understand what Colt said, you have to understand what Colt has always been allowed to say. Growing up, he was the one my parents called direct. That was the word Philip used consistently, like it was a personality type rather than a permission structure. Colt is just direct, he'd say. Whenever Colt said something that left a mark on somebody, he doesn't mean it the way it sounds. You know how he is. And we did know how he was. That was exactly the problem. We knew, and we adjusted, and Colt never once had to. He's 29. He works inconsistently in real estate wholesaling, which in Colt's case meant he identified distressed properties, connected sellers to buyers, and collected a finder's fee when deals closed. It sounds more stable than it was. There were months where he made real money, and there were longer stretches where he was borrowing from my dad, and the borrowing was never discussed at any volume that would make anyone uncomfortable. My dad would quietly transfer funds, and Colt would quietly not mention it, and my mom would set an extra place at Sunday dinner like everything was fine, and I would sit across from my brother and watch him eat and think, does he even know? Does he actually know what this costs everyone? He knew. I'm certain he knew, he just never had to account for it. The 8 months he'd been living back home before my collapse, that had started after a deal went sideways, and he lost what he described as a significant amount of someone else's money. He didn't elaborate. My dad didn't ask. I asked once, carefully, and Colt looked at me with that particular expression he saves for when he thinks I'm being naive, and said, "It's handled, Britta. Not everything needs to be a case file." That was the other thing. My job. Colt found my work vaguely aggressive. The idea that I spent my days finding the places where numbers didn't add up, where someone's story had a seam in it. He made jokes about it at family dinners. Called me the auditor. Said things like, "Better watch what you say around Britta, she'll put you under oath." Everyone laughed, including me, including my mom. It was easier to laugh. Marcus never laughed at those jokes. I noticed that. Filed it away the way I file away most things. Quietly, without acting on it immediately. In the 2 weeks before my collapse, I had been working a particularly brutal case. A regional surgical center had been submitting duplicate claims across 3 different insurers for the same procedures. Which sounds technical and dry until you realize that the amounts involved crossed into 7 figures, and that someone very deliberate had constructed this across 18 months. I was the one who found the seam. I was the one who had to document it, verify it, and prepare it for referral. My direct supervisor kept pushing the timeline forward. My blood pressure kept climbing. I kept telling myself, after this case, I'll slow down after this case. I didn't make it to after this case. Here's what I pieced together in the days following the hospital. While I was at home on mandatory rest, while Marcus brought me soup I didn't eat, and tea that went cold on the nightstand, Colt had known I was pregnant. We'd told immediate family at 12 weeks. He'd nodded, said, "Congrats," moved on within 30 seconds to asking my dad about something unrelated. Marcus noticed that too. He mentioned it to me once, lightly, and I said Colt's just not a big emotions person, and Marcus looked at me for a moment and then said, "Okay," in a tone that meant something different than okay. And now here's where it starts to pull tight, the thread that had been loose the whole time. 3 weeks before my collapse, Colt had called me. Not a text, an actual call, which was unusual. He'd asked, casual and circling, whether Marcus and I had updated our estate documents since the pregnancy. I told him we were planning to, hadn't gotten there yet. He said, "Smart, you should really do that soon, you never know," and then changed the subject before I could respond. I thought nothing of it at the time. I was in the middle of the billing case. I had a client call in 4 minutes. I filed it and moved on. Lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, that call came back to me with a different weight entirely, because the day after my collapse, Before I was even discharged, Colt had said something to my dad in the hallway outside my room. I didn't hear it directly. Dessa heard it. She'd stepped out to use the restroom and came back slowly because she could hear voices and didn't want to interrupt, and she caught the tail end. She didn't tell me what she heard until later, but the first piece she shared was this. Colt had used the phrase, if something had happened to both of them, not to Britta, both of them. And Dessa said the way he said it wasn't grief, it wasn't fear, it was, she struggled to find the right word. She said it felt like he was doing math. I didn't know what to do with that yet. I was still in the hospital, I had just lost my daughter, I was still in that specific underwater silence that follows the worst moment of your life, where everything outside the immediate radius of your body feels like it's happening behind glass. But I have spent my entire career learning to notice the details that don't fit. And that one was already snagged on something inside me, pulling, and I hadn't even heard what Colt said in the room yet. The thing that made my mother leave. The nurse had been adjusting my fore. Marcus was standing near the window. My dad was near the door. My mom was beside me, and Colt walked in 14 minutes after my parents, like I said, already talking. And then looked at me, looked at my stomach, and said, well, at least now you can focus on getting your numbers back up at work. The room didn't go quiet. It went somewhere worse than quiet. There's a specific kind of silence that isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of everyone in a room suddenly processing the same thing at the same time, and nobody's processing speed is fast enough, and for just a second, everybody freezes. That's what happened. Marcus went completely still at the window. The nurse stopped moving. My dad made a sound that wasn't a word, and my mom, who has spent 34 years smoothing, translating, absorbing, turned to look at Colt with an expression I have never seen on her face once in my entire life. Not anger, it was past anger, it was recognition, like she had finally, after decades, allowed herself to see something clearly. She turned to my dad, and she said, you knew he was like this, and you kept making excuses. 4 words. Well, more than 4, I miscounted in the shock of it, but the weight of it was 4 words. You kept making excuses. And then she picked up her purse from the chair beside my bed, squeezed my hand once, just once, firm and certain, and walked out of the room. Philip followed her. Of course he followed her. He's been following the current of whatever Colt needed his whole life. Following his wife out a door was at least following someone worth following. Colt stood there for a moment looking at the space where they'd been, and then he looked at me, and I think he expected me to fill the silence the way I have filled silences for him my entire life. Smooth it. Soften it. Say something that made it easier. I didn't say anything. Marcus walked to the door and held it open. You should go, he said. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just flat and certain, the way Marcus is when he has made up his mind entirely. Colt left. The nurse finished adjusting my IV without making eye contact with either of us, which was the most merciful thing anyone did for me that day. In the days that followed, I learned things in pieces. My mom called me from a hotel 20 minutes from my parents' house. She'd booked it herself, with her own card. Which sounds unremarkable until you know that Renata Callahan has not made a significant financial decision independently in 34 years of marriage. Not because she wasn't capable, but because Philip ran the accounts and she let him because it was easier, because Colt always needed something and it was easier not to look too closely. She called me and her voice was steady in a way that frightened me slightly. The way very still water can be frightening when you can't see the bottom. I've been seeing it for a long time, she said. I just kept deciding that seeing it was the same as it not being true. I didn't know what to say to that either. I was getting good at sitting in silences that weren't mine to fill. Here's what I started understanding. Slowly, as my body healed and my mind started doing what my mind always does. Finding the seam, pulling the thread, following it back to its origin. Colt's phone call 3 weeks before my collapse. The estate documents question, at least now you can focus on getting your numbers back up. A phrase Dessa overheard. if something had happened to both of them. Marcus and I had life insurance policies we'd set up when we got married. Significant ones. The kind you get when you're both professionals with a mortgage and plans for a family. We had discussed updating the beneficiary structure when I got pregnant, which was standard and reasonable, but we hadn't gotten there yet, which meant that the current documents were still structured the way we'd set them up 3 years ago. Colt knew about the policies because I had mentioned them offhandedly at a family dinner, maybe 18 months back, when the conversation turned to financial planning. I'd said something about how Marcus and I had been smart about it early, and Philip had nodded approvingly, and Colt had asked, just casually, what kind of coverage? I'd given a vague number. I didn't think about it again. I was thinking about it now. I called the fraud investigator and myself, the way you call in a colleague for a second opinion. I laid it out flat. Colt needs money, has needed money for years. Colt knew the policies existed. Colt asked specifically about estate updates 3 weeks before a high-stress period at my job. A period I had mentioned to my parents at Sunday dinner. Colt used the phrase, both of them, while I was still in the hospital. Colt's first response to my loss was about my professional performance. None of that was a crime. I want to be clear about that. None of that, individually, was anything more than a portrait of a callous and self-interested man doing the math that self-interested men do. But it was a pattern, and I have spent my entire career knowing that patterns are where the truth lives. Marcus, when I brought it to him quietly one evening, sat with it for a long time. He's not a reactor. He listens to the whole thing before he speaks, which is one of the reasons I married him. When I finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I wasn't sure yet. I needed more of the picture first. My mom, from her hotel, had started talking to an attorney. Not about Colt, about Philip, about the accounts, the years of financial decisions made without her, the specific legal shape of a marriage where one person holds all the financial access and the other person holds all the faith. She called me every evening, and each call she sounded more like herself. A version of herself I don't think I'd ever actually met. Direct, clear, slightly wry. She told me, "I think I forgot what I was like before I spent 30 years managing everyone's comfort." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up, and then I opened my laptop and started pulling threads. I want to tell you something about the way I work, because it matters here. I don't move fast. I never have. Every colleague I've ever had processes quicker than me, in the room, in the meeting, in the moment of confrontation. I'm the one who looks like she's not paying attention, who asks to circle back, who says, "Let me think on that." And then I go home and I reconstruct the entire thing from memory, every detail, every pause, every word that was chosen over another word, and I find the place where it doesn't quite hold. It took me 11 days. 11 days of rest, of Marcus's soup getting cold, of phone calls with my mom, of sitting very still with my laptop and my notepad, and the very specific kind of grief that makes everything feel both unbearably heavy and crystalline clear at the same time. Grief, I have learned, is actually excellent for investigative thinking. It strips out all the noise. You stop being polite. You stop being careful of everyone's feelings. You just look. Here's what I found. Colt had been named as a contingent beneficiary on my original life insurance policy. Not the primary, that was Marcus, but the contingent, meaning he collected if Marcus and I both died. This was a default structure from 3 years ago that I had never updated because I intended to and hadn't. Standard oversight. Thousands of people have the same gap in their documents. It means nothing on its own. Except, 8 months ago, around the time Colt moved back into my parents' house, he had asked my dad for what Philip described to me as a loan for a bridge situation on a deal. My dad had transferred $43,000 directly into an account Philip thought was Colt's personal checking. I got this information from my mom, who'd found the transfer records while going through the joint accounts with her attorney. $43,000. The same period Colt claimed a deal had gone sideways and lost someone else's money. My mom's attorney requested full account records going back 5 years as part of her filing process. What they found was a pattern. Not one transfer, not one loan, but 9 separate transfers over 4 years, totaling just under $200,000, each one described in Philip's own records as Loan C, with no repayment terms, no documentation, no collateral. My dad had been quietly funding Colt for years, at a scale neither my mom nor I had any idea about. When my mom saw the total, she called me, and she didn't speak for a moment, and then she said, "He protected Colt from every consequence his entire life, and he used our money to do it without telling me." I asked her how she felt. She said, "Like I lived in a house with a room I wasn't allowed to enter, and I just found out what was in it. Now layer this with what I already knew." Colt's question about my estate documents, 3 weeks before my collapse. The both of them comment to my father. The immediate pivot. In the hospital room, to my professional performance rather than my loss. I want to be careful here, and I want to be honest. I never found anything that constituted a legal threat. There was no direct evidence that Colt had done anything beyond being the person he has always been. Calculating, self-focused, watching the angles. But what I found was enough to protect myself going forward, which is what investigation actually is most of the time, not exposure. Preparation. Marcus and I updated every document within the week. New beneficiary structure, new estate plan, attorney reviewed and filed. Colt's name removed from every contingent position, with a clean, legal paper trail that I will keep. I also had a conversation with my supervisor at work about the billing case. I'd been carrying it alone longer than I should have because I was afraid that slowing down meant falling behind. And falling behind in my field means cases go cold, and people who built elaborate frauds get to keep building them. But my supervisor, when I finally told her the full scope of the stress I'd been under, looked at me and said, "Britta, you collapsed. The case can have a second set of eyes." I cried in her office. Not elegantly. She handed me a box of tissues without making it awkward, which is the best thing you can do in those moments. My mom moved into a short-term rental apartment. She found it herself, signed the lease herself, and sent me a photo of the empty living room with the caption, "It's small. I love it." Philip called me once. During this period, he wanted to talk about Renata. He was bewildered. That was the word that kept surfacing, bewildered, like a man who has arranged his entire household around a certain order of things and cannot understand why the furniture has stopped cooperating. He said, "I don't know what she's so upset about. I was trying to handle things quietly so nobody worried." I said, "Dad, she was nobody." Long silence. He said, "That's not what I meant." I said, "I know. That's why it's so hard to explain." I didn't feel powerful saying it. I felt tired and sad and very certain, which is actually what power feels like most of the time when it's real. Not triumphant, just clear. The last piece that needed to be handled was Colt. I had not spoken to him since Marcus walked him out of my hospital room. He had texted me once, 4 days later, "Hope you're recovering okay." No acknowledgement of what he'd said, no acknowledgement of what our mom had done. Just a performance of normalcy, thin enough to see through. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing him, because I had nothing to say that would change anything. And I have learned, slowly, at great cost, that trying to change someone who doesn't experience consequences is a form of self-harm. I'm no longer willing to perform, but there was one conversation I still needed to have. I called Colt on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the hospital. I didn't tell Marcus I was doing it, which is the only secret I kept from him during this entire period. And I kept it because I knew he would want to be in the room, and I needed to do this alone. Not because it was going to be dramatic. Because it wasn't. Because I needed him to hear my voice. Without an audience, without the performance that Colt always runs when other people are watching. He picked up on the third ring. "Britta?" Not surprised. Maybe a little wary. "I've been going through some things since the hospital," I said. "Some paperwork. Estate stuff. I wanted to let you know, Marcus and I have fully updated everything. Beneficiaries, structures, all of it. Attorney reviewed. Everything is airtight now." Silence. "Okay," he said. "That's smart. You should have done that when you first got pregnant." "You're right," I said. I should have. Another silence. Shorter. Is that why you called? Mostly, I said. I also wanted to tell you that what you said in that hospital room about my numbers at work, I'm not angry about it anymore. I understand who you are now in a way I didn't let myself before, and that's actually useful information for me. He started to say something. I could hear the shape of it, the beginning of a deflection, a reframe, a version of your being too sensitive that he's been perfecting for 29 years. I didn't let him get there. I'm not asking for an apology, I said. I know you don't have one. I'm just letting you know that I see you clearly now, and I'm going to act accordingly. Take care of yourself, Colt. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after. The house was quiet. Marcus was in the other room. I could hear him. Small sounds. Familiar sounds. And I focused on those for a while. I want to tell you the ending of this story isn't a victory lap. Because it isn't. My daughter is still gone. That fact doesn't rearrange itself no matter what else gets resolved. I think about her every single day. The name we gave her, the rocking chair Marcus refinished twice, the color on the nursery wall that I still haven't been able to look at directly. Grief doesn't wrap up. It just changes shape. It becomes something you carry differently over time, shifting the weight when one side gets too heavy. But here is what is also true. My mom is in her apartment. She video calls me 3 times a week now. She started a pottery class, which she has described as deeply humbling and wonderful, and last week she sent me a photo of a lopsided bowl she made and said it was her first thing that was entirely and only hers. I cried for 10 minutes after that text. Good crying. The kind that means something is healing. Philip is in a difficult season. I don't hate my father. I think he is a man who confused protection with control and called it love for so long that he genuinely cannot feel the difference. That's its own tragedy. He's talking to someone, a therapist, finally, at his doctor's recommendation. And I hope it helps. I genuinely hope it helps. I don't have room for anything more complicated than hope right now. Colt and I don't speak. That's not a dramatic rupture. It's just an honest distance that I've stopped trying to close. Some relationships only function when one person keeps absorbing things they shouldn't, and when that person stops, there's nothing underneath. Now I know what was underneath. It wasn't nothing. It was just his reflection in my willingness. And I've put that mirror down. Marcus and I have started talking about trying again. Slowly, carefully, with Dr. Vane managing every detail with a level of attention that makes me feel both safe and fragile simultaneously. We haven't made a decision yet. Some days it feels possible. Some days the rocking chair in the room down the hall feels like its own kind of answer. We're sitting with it. We're still here, which is the thing I couldn't have guaranteed on the floor of my office that Tuesday, and so we start there. I told my supervisor about the full shape of the billing case and recommended it be assigned to a 2-person team going forward. She agreed. The case is still open. The seam is still there. It'll be found eventually, by me or by someone just as stubborn. That's how these things go. The thing I want to leave you with, the piece that took me 3 weeks of mandatory rest and a lot of cold tea and my mother's voice on the phone to understand, is this. Sometimes the worst moment of your life is the moment that finally gives everyone else permission to show you who they are, not who you hoped they were. Not who they told you they were. Who they actually are, in the room, in the silence, in the very first thing they choose to say. And that information, as devastating as it arrives, is the most useful thing you will ever receive. I know who I'm building my life with now. I know who is in my corner, and I know who was calculating angles while I was still on the floor. I know what my mother sounds like when she's finally speaking in her own voice. I know what Marcus's hand feels like in a room where everything else has gone wrong. That's not a small thing. That's actually everything. If any part of this story stayed with you, if something landed, if you found yourself thinking about someone in your own life while you were listening, please leave a comment below. I read them. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Like this video if it meant something to you. Subscribe if you want to stay. You've been here through all of it. And that means something too.